Tonight's program features Dr. Micah Kubik, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Kansas. Dr. Kubik joined the ACLU of Kansas in January 2015 with more than 15 years of experience in civil liberties, civil rights, and racial justice work. Prior to coming to the ACLU, Micah was the Director of Planning, Development, and Evaluation at the Full Employment Council, a nonprofit organization that provides employment and training services to more than 50,000 Kansas City area residents each year. In that role, Micah led the planning, research, evaluation, government compliance, program design, resource development, and community engagement activities of a $17 million agency. Micah previously served as the Senior Program Officer at Greater Kansas City Local Initiative Support Corporation, where he worked directly with 6 urban core neighborhoods to improve their quality of life. Micah has worked as a legislative director for a Kansas City councilman, an analyst of education policy at the American Federation of Teachers, an analyst of housing policies at the nationally respected Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and as a public affairs and public policy consultant. Micah is active in many community organizations, including service on many boards of directors. He is currently the chairman of the worldwide board of directors of People to People International, a group founded by President Dwight Eisenhower to advance the cause of international peace and understanding. Micah holds bachelor's degrees from George Washington University, as well as a master's degree and a doctorate in Black politics from Howard University. His first book, Freedom Incorporated and the Fight for African American Empowerment, was published by the University of Missouri Press in 2016. So everybody please welcome Dr. Kubik.
Well, good evening, everyone.
Hi.
We'll try again. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Much better, thank you. So my name is Micah Kubik. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Kansas, and I'm very happy to be here with you this evening. When we picked this topic to talk about voting rights this evening, we had no idea it would be quite so timely, because of course today is election day here in Wichita. So thank you very much for coming this evening, and in spite of having the election on the very same day. So what I want to talk with you about tonight is the subject of voting rights, and as part of this series of candid conversations, especially how voting rights impacts the question of race and racism, and how these things are intertwined, both locally in Kansas as well as nationally. And I think that it's very important that we do that because historically and presently, the subjects of voting rights and race are completely and totally intertwined and interconnected. You cannot separate the two from each other, especially in their historical and current manifestations. Now, there's a lot going on right now with voting rights all around the country, and there's a lot about the right to vote. Many of those discussions about voting rights begin from the premise that voting is important. And then we automatically pass on to the next part of the discussion without ever really pausing for even one moment to think about why it is the vote is so important in the first place. And no matter what the subject is, I think it is always a mistake to pass over the why question and to spring immediately into the what and the how and wherefore. I think we have to talk for a moment about why the vote is important, why voting is important in order to understand the topic at all. And so I think there are a couple key points about why the vote is important. First of all, almost self-evidently, America is supposed to be a democracy, right? America is intended to be a democracy. In a democracy, people vote. That's kind of what it is, sort of the definition. In a democracy, people vote. We think it's important. And we want people to vote as often as possible, not in each election, right? So don't vote more than once in each election, but every opportunity you legally have the chance to vote, we encourage people to vote, because America is a democracy. Secondly, and related to that, voting is how people express themselves in public life. It's how they have any influence over the process whatsoever. We don't go and make America a democracy just for the sake of showing up and doing something, for showing up and pulling a lever. No. Voting is part of democracy because that is how we participate in public life, how we make our opinions known, how we try and influence public policy, how we try and influence the decisions that get made around us. Third, this one often gets passed over in the current discussion, but that's that voting is a right. In the United States, you have a right to vote, not a privilege to vote, not an opportunity to vote, but the right to vote. Sometimes folks who are trying to restrict the vote say that, oh, voting is the greatest privilege that we have as American citizens, and that's horsepucky, because you have the right to vote. The right to vote is mentioned 4 separate times in the Constitution, more than many other rights that we take for granted. And so this idea that voting is anything other than a right is silly and wrong on its face. And most importantly, the thing that I think is most relevant to the discussion about why voting is important is because the vote is not really about going on election day and pulling that lever or filling in a little circle on your ballot. It's not even really so much about you directly influencing public policy on any given day. Rather, the vote, the right to vote, is a marker of citizenship. It's a sign of who is part of the community and who is not, who is included as part of the society and who is not, who has a voice and who does not, who is included, who is excluded, who is included, who is exiled. If you do not have the right to vote, we are essentially saying that you are not part of the community. We don't value you. You are not part of something larger than yourself. And so the right to vote is really not about partisanship or petty politics or participation in the political process at all. Sure, that's part of it. But the bigger, more important thing that the right to vote is about who counts. Who counts? Who is included? Who is part of the community? Who is not? And when we say that you have the right to vote, what we're saying is that you count. And when we try and expand the franchise, make more people included, what we're saying is that everyone counts. And I think that brings us directly to the question of how voting rights and race are intertwined. Because for most of the history of this country, most of the people who lived here were not, in fact, included, did not, in fact, count, did not have the right to vote, were not part of the community, were not part of the society at all. And their exclusion from the broader society was directly proportional to their exclusion from the ballot and from the franchise. Most of the time, folks have not counted. That's why we have had to have separate amendments to the Constitution in order to expand the right to vote, in order to include people who previously did not count. So, for example, in 1789, when the country was founded, the overwhelming majority of the people who lived here did not count, did not have the right to vote. In fact, in 1789, just 6% of the population was eligible to vote. Just 6% of the country was eligible to vote, were thought enough of to count. And who were those 6%? Rich, white men. Not just men, not just white men, rich white men were the only folks who counted at all. And so if you go back to the founding of the country, you see there are a lot of folks who don't take too kindly to that. Because amazingly, when you tell someone that they don't count, they don't like it. Folks don't like to be told that they are not part of the community, that their voice is not important. And that's why folks fought to expand the franchise and the right to vote. And make no mistake about it, it was a fight. It was long, it was hard, it was oftentimes bloody, and that's because voting is a right. People don't do those things for privileges. That's how we can distinguish the fact that the right to vote is in fact a right and not a privilege. Nobody dies for privileges. Nobody is willing to lay down their life for a privilege. They are, however, willing to lay down their lives for rights. And that's why we see a gradual expansion of the franchise from 1789 onwards, right? First, we expanded to poor white men. So both rich white men and poor white men get to vote in the early 1800s. And then, of course, we fought a little thing called the Civil War that had a direct relevance for voting rights of African American men. Because after the Civil War, we decided that since there was in fact a war fought over whether African Americans counted or not, whether they were in fact considered part of the community, or even considered human for that matter, we decided that since we fought a war over that and hundreds of thousands of African Americans died for the Union Army, that perhaps it would be a good idea to extend the right to vote to African American men. Now, it's very important to note, too, that before the Civil War happened, there was no such thing as African Americans. In fact, the very conscious language was Africans, because people were so intent on the idea that African Americans were not American at all, because they were not citizens, did not have the right to vote, did not count. But that starts to change after the Civil War, and citizenship, real citizenship, is extended to African American men. Still not to African American women, mind you, just to African American men. And even at the time, it was a very controversial thing. In fact, some of the suffragettes who we think very highly of today, I mean, many of them were on record in the 1860s as saying that we should not give the franchise to African American men, that it was not important, and that if we were going to give it to anyone at all, it should be to white women first, and then maybe later on we could think about African American men. And of course, suffragettes and the Black Freedom Movement were pitted against one another in that struggle before African American men got the right to vote through not one, but two separate constitutional amendments. Why did it take two? Because there were so many folks who were opposed to the idea, were trying to undermine it even after the first constitutional amendment was passed, that they had to pass a second one to close the loopholes from the first. Because again, if it were just about people showing up on election day, there might not have been quite as much contentiousness. It would not be quite as controversial. But it's about more than just showing up on election day. It's about whether or not you believe that others have basic human dignity or not. And that was still a contested proposition after the Civil War, before passage of the suffrage amendments. And so then, of course, we continue to expand the franchise. In the early 20th century, white women get the right to vote through the passage, again, of a constitutional amendment. But in the meantime, African American men had effectively lost the right to vote all over the country through Jim Crow laws. And they were very ingenious in restricting the right to vote of black men. Even though the Constitution had been amended, they found ways still to undermine it, to get around the express letter of the law in order to restrict the right to vote. And they did that through a couple ways, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But in the meantime, there was definitely a pushback, right? So again, because people want to count, people want to matter, people want to be part of the community, there was a movement for voting rights, especially, but not exclusively, in the South, where, until the 1960s, most African Americans in the country still lived. And I think what is important to know, especially today, so today we talk a lot about how voting rights are restricted. There are a lot of folks who want to say that race has nothing to do with the current restrictions. Because after all, they say none of the current restrictions that we'll talk about more in a minute, none of those current voting restrictions expressly mention African Americans or Latinos or Asians or race at all. If you look at the current raft of restrictions, not a single one of them mentions race anywhere at all. And so the folks who promote voting restrictions say they couldn't possibly have anything to do with race or racism because no one mentions that. They're not in the text. They're nowhere. Well, let's take a moment to look back at the voting restrictions that took place after the Civil War, during the Jim Crow era, and before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For example, we had the infamous literacy tests where in order to register to vote, you had to come and be able to read and interpret some particular piece of writing. Sometimes it was a novel, sometimes it was very complicated language from the Constitution of the state. Your interpretation, whether it was satisfactory or not, was always subject to the approval of the actual examiner, the registrar who was there. There was no objective standard, it was just the registrar determined whether or not you had satisfied the literacy requirement. The literacy test never said anything about African Americans. There's not a single literacy test law anywhere in the country that mentioned black, African American, or any other racial category name that was in use at the time in the language of the law. The literacy test said nothing about race, and yet it was used every single day. Or you have the poll tax, another infamous restriction used at that time, where in order to register to vote, in addition to the normal taxes that you pay as a citizen of the United States, you had to pay an additional tax in order to register to vote, oftentimes quite a hefty one, in many places equivalent to 6 and 9 months' earnings for working class people in the South. The poll tax said nothing about race, said nothing about African Americans. It did not apply just to African Americans, it applied to absolutely everyone. Everyone had to pay the poll tax in states that had them. There's no mention of race or racism or anything else. Or you had another famous one where voting registrars, so the folks who actually get you registered, would be open on alternate Tuesdays from 12 to 1 p.m. 3 months of the year. Limited hours, right? So expressly limited hours designed to make it as hard as possible for folks, especially those who had to work for a living, to come and register to vote. Now again, the limited hours weren't somehow magically waived for other folks. There was nothing specific about limited hours that had anything to do with race or racism expressly. It was simply limited hours, you got what you had. Or you had another one, the voucher system, where in order to register to vote, you had to have someone else come in and vouch for you. Someone who was already on the voter registration rolls had to come in and say that you were in fact a person of good reputation who was in fact a good citizen who deserved to be on the voting rolls. Again, are you detecting a pattern here? No mention of race, racism, African Americans, whites, or anything else. Applies to everyone. Or you have the grandfather clause. This one is famous, although often misinterpreted. People get it wrong. What the grandfather clause said was that all of those other restrictions that I just mentioned to you, they would not apply to you at all. You could be waived from them if your grandfather had been on the voting rolls. And of course, in the 1880s, 1890s, etc., no one who was African American had a grandfather who was on the voting rolls because they were enslaved at the time. But the grandfather clause itself makes no explicit mention of race. It seems very race neutral, in fact. It seems like a pass, and you were going to make it easier for you. All you have to show is that you had a grandfather who was on the voting rolls. And so even though every last one of these restrictions that we now think of as notorious and illegal and immoral, just plain wrong, even though every last one of them was explicitly race neutral. In fact, the authors went to great effort to make sure that race was not mentioned in the text of the law, even though they were race neutral. Does anyone doubt for a moment what their intent was? Their intent was exactly what their effect was, which was to disenfranchise millions of African Americans, especially, but not exclusively, in the South. That's what they did. They succeeded. They achieved it. And yet, none of those things said anything about race, which ought to be an instructive lesson for us today. That just because the current law on voting restrictions makes no mention of race does not mean that these tools are not racist or do not have racist and racial implications. Now, in the meantime, folks fought back right? They fought back against all of these various restrictions on the right to vote. They organized, they mobilized all across the South, and ultimately succeeded in passing yet another amendment to the Constitution. Isn't it a shame that we have to have 4 separate amendments to the Constitution just to protect the right to vote? I'm glad we have them, but it's a shame at the same time that it took not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 separate amendments to the Constitution to try and make sure that folks had their right to vote protected. And at the same time that they were passing a constitutional amendment in 1965, they passed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Perhaps the single most effective piece of legislation ever passed in the United States. I don't care what subject area it is, the Voting Rights Act is perhaps the single most effective piece of legislation ever passed in terms of doing the thing that it said it would do, right? It made it possible to get rid, essentially, of all of those restrictions on the right to vote that I mentioned. And so it banned the literacy test, banned the poll tax, created federal supervision of voter registrars all across the country, created what we call federal pre-clearance provisions where authorities in sort of targeted jurisdictions had to get federal approval before they could change their voting rights laws, so they couldn't always mess around in ways on short notice that would make it harder for people to vote. And the result was that black voter registration and Latino voter registration, and for that matter, the voter registration of low-income whites all across the South, skyrocketed. So, for example, in Mississippi, in 1965, exactly 6.7% of African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote. Less than 7% were registered to vote, and almost none of them actually got to vote. Because, of course, there was brute intimidation of those folks who dared to try and show up after they got on the rolls. But 6.7% of the folks, African American folks in Mississippi, were registered to vote in 1965. By 1970, so just 5 years later, that number had jumped to 65%. In South Carolina, there were about 37% of the folks, African Americans, who were registered to vote in 1965. 75% of them were registered to vote by 1970. In Alabama, it was about 19% in 1965, almost 70% just 5 years later. All across the South, you see that sort of dramatic jump in the number of folks who are registered to vote, which again tells you something about the system of voter restriction that was in place. It tells you, first of all, that it was very effective, but it also tells you that once you got rid of that system, once you made it easy for people to participate, once you made it easy for people to be part of the process, most of them wanted to be. Most people want to count. Most people want to be part of their community. And when you reduce the burdens and barriers to them for doing so, they actually show up. They participate. They register. They vote. Now, all of that, so the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it ought to be a triumphant story. It is, I suppose it is a triumphant story, at least in the short term, right? I mean, you see dramatic gains in registration. You see some degree of standardization of the voter registration process around the country. Those are things to crow about. Those are things to be excited about. But in the long run, it's not quite so triumphant of a story, and that's because the history of the Voting Rights Act doesn't stop in 1970, or even 1980, or 1990, or 2000, and it hasn't even stopped in 2017 yet. What we do know, however, is that even though there emerged a broad consensus about the Voting Rights Act and the things that it did, and even though most people said they agreed that we should make it easy for people to register and turn out to vote, the fact of the matter is that for about the last 15 years, there has been a really sustained campaign to undermine the right to vote and to attack the Voting Rights Act. Now, that campaign has been active for the last 15 years, but it didn't just start 15 years ago. It's been going on since the day the thing was passed in 1965. The reason being that some people are just not reconciled to the idea that all Americans count, that all Americans matter. And there has always been a contingent in this country that has tried to exclude some people based on who they are or what they look like or where they come from or what they believe. There has always been someone who wants to say that someone else's voice should not be heard. Unfortunately, that has often had racial overtones, but it's not the only way. But ever since the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, folks have tried to undo it. For example, in the 1980s, in the Reagan administration, there was a fella in the Department of Justice, in the Attorney General's office, who worked really hard to change the way the Department of Justice worked on voting rights cases. So in previous administrations, whether they were Republican or Democratic, the Department of Justice intervened strongly to defend the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and to apply it to jurisdictions. And even the Reagan administration did this, despite the fact that there was one particular fella in the Department of Justice who argued strongly that the administration should get rid of the Voting Rights Act entirely, that it should try and urge Congress to get rid of it. That fella was named John Roberts, and he later went on to become the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. As a surprise, when, just a few years ago, the United States Supreme Court, now with John Roberts as its Chief Justice, struck down the single most important provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the so-called preclearance provision that requires states, localities, that had a history of voter suppression, especially racially motivated voter suppression, required them to get federal government approval before they could make changes to their voting rights laws. Now, it's a myth that the only places that had this particular requirement, that had to get approval, were all in the South. That's not true at all. That's what some folks will tell you to try and say, oh, it's biased against the South, or just picking on Southerners, et cetera, et cetera. Nonsense. Would anyone like to know my favorite jurisdiction that was covered by the preclearance provision? New York City. Is New York City in the South? No. They're a bunch of Yankees, right? They even named their team the Yankees. New York City was covered by the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act because the way they decided which places were eligible and had to be covered was that any place where less than 50% of the voting age eligible population were registered was a place that was covered. Because they said if less than 50% of the people who are eligible to vote are actually registered to vote, there's probably something else going on here. Whether it be race or classism or just bureaucratic sort of nonsense. There's something else going on in that place that's making it hard for people to register to vote. And so they picked every jurisdiction in the country where less than 50% of the voting age population was registered. Now, most of those places were in the South, but not all of them. And so that made it particularly ridiculous when the Supreme Court struck down the key part of the Voting Rights Act by saying that we were simply trading on past history, that we were simply picking on the South for things that had happened in the 1950s and 60s, which is not actually how it unfolded at all. It was historically inaccurate as well as being morally wrong. And so the Supreme Court struck down a key part of the Voting Rights Act, said you don't have to get federal permission anymore. Now, mind you, even when that permission, that preclearance was in place, states could still contest it. It wasn't an absolute rule. It wasn't that the federal government stopped them from doing something they wanted to do, period, end of story. No, those states and localities could then sue, could take it to court, and could prove that the change they were trying to make was not, in fact, racially motivated or would not disproportionately impact people based on race. They could do that. Most of them chose not to because they knew they were wrong and they would lose, but they could do it if they wanted to. The Supreme Court said none of that matters, struck down the preclearance provision by saying that racism is no longer a relevant consideration. Said that it was no longer part of the American story, and so didn't matter enough to take any sort of legislative action about it. The very same day that that ruling came down from the United States Supreme Court, 3 states introduced laws to make registering to vote harder. The very same day, that afternoon, there were new voting restrictions in place, in places that would have been covered by the provision that just got struck down by the Supreme Court. And since that time, 22 states, many of them in the South, but not exclusively so, 22 states have passed new restrictions that make it harder to register to vote, harder to show up and vote, and harder to make that vote count. 22 states. Now, some have said that those restrictions are about voter fraud, stopping it, even though it does not exist. They say that they are necessary to stop voter fraud. Some folks don't say that. They say it's just designed to make elections easier to run. There seems to be no truth in that either, because usually they're adding new requirements, not getting rid of existing ones. And then some folks say that it's not really about race at all, it's about party, right? It's about one side or the other trying to make it harder for the other side's voters to show up, turn out and vote, have a voice. All of those might be true. I don't really believe so. You might, that's fine. We can disagree later. All of those things can be true. But I think what is also true, and what we have to admit, what we have to concede, what we have to deal with, even if we think those other things are true, is that every last one of the restrictions that has been passed has disproportionately harmed African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans. Every last one of them, no matter which of the 22 states they have been in, have disproportionately harmed populations of color. We have a word for that. It's called racist. That's the definition of the word. I want to go through with you just a few of the restrictions that have been passed over the last couple of years. So, for example, the great state of Wisconsin created a very strict voter ID law in the year 2011. Federal courts ruled it so strict, so hard for folks to get the types of photo identification required, that they said it was an unconstitutional burden on low-income people and people of color. Because it was hard to get the ID and expensive to get the types of ID that you were allowed to show in order to show up and vote at the polls. The federal court said it was unconstitutional. Now, ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed them to keep it in place just for the 2016 elections. They said it was too difficult to try a different system during the 2016 elections. But there is still litigation about this, and the previous court's finding that it was an unconstitutional burden on people of color actually remains in place for the meantime. And the reason was borne out by the election itself. Because in 2016, the government itself estimated that 300,000 people in Wisconsin who were eligible to vote did not have the type of photo ID that was required to show up at the polls. 300,000 people in the state of Wisconsin did not have the type of photo ID that was required, even though they were eligible citizens and should have been able to vote. And the overwhelming majority of those folks who did not have photo ID lived in two places, Milwaukee and Madison, the two places in the state of Wisconsin that have diverse populations where African Americans and Latinos live. In Florida, a state that perpetually seems to have problems with voting, they have a very strict disenfranchisement law, which means that if you have ever been convicted of a crime, it is almost impossible to get the right to vote back in the state of Florida. Now, there are a lot of states around the country that say that if you have been convicted of a crime, you are disenfranchised. You know? Not everywhere. Some places, in fact, let you vote even while you're in prison. In Vermont, even if you are serving time in state prison for a felony, you still get to vote. They send your ballot to the prison. You get it notarized there. But there are other states where once you have served your time, either finished your time in prison or finished your time in prison plus probation and parole, you get your rights back almost automatically. Sometimes it really is automatically. They give you your voter registration card as you leave the prison grounds. Other times you just send in a form. That's the way it is here in the state of Kansas. If you serve time in prison, after you have completed your sentence, your probation, and your parole, you just send in a form to the Secretary of State's office saying that you've completed your service, your debt to society has been repaid, and then you're automatically added back to the voter registration rolls. That's not the way it is in Florida. In Florida, they have made it almost impossible. In order to get your rights restored in Florida, you have to go through a very lengthy application process and appeal before the State Board of Clemency. So the same board that lets people go on probation or ends someone's sentence early is the same board that considers whether or not you can have your rights restored. You have to go in person. You have to make a formal application. You have to essentially justify yourself to the Board of Clemency to say that you should get your rights back. And over the last several years, they've changed it to make the rules even harder. So in the year 2012, there were about 40,000 people a year who were getting their rights back in Florida. It's a big state, 40,000 people a year were getting their rights restored in Florida. By 2016, it was only about 1,500 a year that were getting their rights back, 1,500. And the result of all of that is that today, there are 1.5 million Florida citizens who are disenfranchised because of a criminal conviction. 1.5 million people. That's half of the state population of Kansas, mind you. Kansas has 3 million people. We're talking about 1.5 million people in Florida who cannot vote ever again because of this unwieldy process. And what's worse, 1 in 4 African Americans in the state of Florida is included in that 1.5 million number. So 25% of the state's African American population is impacted by that disenfranchisement and is prevented from getting their rights back. That sort of outcome is not an accident. It's not an accident. We know that it's not an accident because when the law on this was passed in the 1880s, the legislators who passed it explicitly said that the reason they were passing such a strict disenfranchisement law was to target African Americans, and that they would send police out in order to arrest and convict African Americans on trumped up charges for the express purpose of disenfranchising them in the future. That's what they read into the record. You can go to the Florida legislature and read the minutes from their debates on this at the time. They said it loud and proud. Now, it may be 120 years later, but the impact is still the same. Or we have North Carolina, which recently has been in the news a lot for its voting restrictions. Because there, federal courts said that the state legislature identified, quote, with surgical precision, end quote, those types of voting and tools used by African Americans, and then got rid of them. In fact, the state legislature commissioned a study to figure out which groups used which types of voting more often, who used advanced voting more often, who used sort of souls to the polls, where churches bus people to the polls, who used certain types of advanced ballots more. They went through and then picked all of the ones that African Americans used disproportionately. So they weren't doing it on accident. They consciously sought out the tools that were most likely to have a racially disparate impact and then got rid of them. And said so on the record that that was why they were doing it. And so state and federal courts have ruled that those things are problematic, and they too are on hold. Many of the 22 states that have adopted new voting rights restrictions since the Supreme Court ruled are places that have strict photo ID laws. So regardless of where it is in the country, we know that 11% of all U.S. citizens, so eligible voters, citizens, do not have the type of photo ID that these laws require. 11%, 1 in 10 of all citizens do not have that kind of photo ID at all. But we also know that 25% of African Americans in this country don't have those forms of ID. 25%, 1 in 4. Again, all of these things do not happen by accident. It's not a coincidence that every last one of these voter restrictions happens to influence and impact people of color. Once, you can say maybe it's a coincidence. Twice, you can say, oh, maybe it's a set of circumstances. Third, weird things happen. But when you're talking about 22 separate places, and every last one of them has the same impact, then by golly, it's probably time to say there's something going on there. Now, I've saved the worst for last. The worst in terms of its impact And the worst because it hits closest to home. Because here in the great state of Kansas, we have really blazed new trails in voter suppression and voter restriction. Because Kansas has the single most onerous law on voter registration that exists anywhere in this country. In fact, it is the single most difficult restriction on voter registration since the 1960s. Period. No matter where it is, Kansas's law is absolutely the most restrictive, most onerous law on voter registration since the days of Jim Crow, since the days when the Voting Rights Act became necessary. And that's because we have something called the documentary proof of citizenship requirement. It sounds noble at first. It sounds like you just have to prove your citizenship. It's about making sure everyone's a citizen. Well, that's not what it's about at all. It's a papers, please requirement that says that in order to register to vote, you have to produce essentially a passport or a birth certificate, which a lot of people don't have for a lot of different reasons. And there's a reason that no other state in the country has adopted this sort of nonsense, because it is so difficult. It disenfranchises so many people that no one else has wanted to try it. Now, there are 4 other states that have adopted similar provisions. They passed the law, but then when it came time to actually implement it, they've all pulled back because they realized just how disenfranchising it could be. And so they chose not to implement their laws. Arizona, Georgia, Alabama. Fine company of people. All decided not to implement this particular restriction. And that's because they saw how it was playing out in Kansas. Here in Kansas, where we know that there are at least 35,000 people who started the voter registration process, but were not able to complete it because they could not provide their proof of citizenship. They didn't have a birth certificate or a passport to show. They didn't have one particular piece of paper to show. That 35,000 number means 1 in 7 voter registrations filed since the law was passed were essentially thrown in the garbage. 1 in 7 people who tried to register to vote in Kansas were told no, that they did not count, that they were not part of the community, that their voice did not matter because they couldn't produce one particular slip of paper that someone decided they ought to have. That's bad enough on its own. That's bad enough on its own. Disenfranchising 1 in 7 people who want to participate is bad enough on its own. But it probably will not surprise you at this point in my comments to learn that the places that were impacted the most were places that had large African American and Latino populations. Now, we don't have any way of knowing person by person who wound up having their registration denied and their race, but what we can do is look at the precincts that they were trying to register from. And what we do know is that all of the precincts in Sedgwick County and Kansas City, Kansas, Wyandotte County, that had large populations of African Americans and Latinos were also at the very top of the list of precincts statewide that had large numbers of registrations that were denied, that were put in suspense. There's a political scientist at Emporia State University who did a study of this, and he went precinct by precinct and found that every last precinct that had large populations made up of people of color were ones that were wildly disproportionately impacted by this law. And that's probably not surprising. That's probably not surprising. Now, of course, they say that all of this is necessary because of voter fraud, that we have to go through all of these things in order to stop voter fraud. There are a couple responses to that. First of all, voter fraud just doesn't really exist in any appreciable way in this country. There's been study after study after study after study that has shown that voter fraud, at least in that way, doesn't get committed with any regularity. In fact, there are a handful of instances in the entire country. Here in Kansas, our Secretary of State has the power to prosecute people for voting crimes. He's the only Secretary of State in the country that has that power. It's unprecedented power. And he is a zealous believer in the idea that voter fraud is real and prevalent. And yet, despite the fact that he is a fervent believer in that concept and has the power to do something about it, he still only managed to turn up 7 cases in a year and a half. which tells you something about how prevalent it really is. But the other point that I would make about this that is relevant to tonight is the fact that this is the oldest excuse in the book. Every single time that there has been a racially disparate voter restriction, going back to the 1860s, every single time a voting restriction has been put on the books, the folks who have supported it have said that it was necessary to stop voter fraud. Whether it was the voucher system, they said we needed the voucher system where somebody comes in and talks for you to prove that you're a real citizen to stop fraud. The poll tax was necessary to stop fraud because, well, who's going to pay to commit fraud? The literacy test was needed to stop fraud because, well, how else can we be sure that someone is really committed to our community? And how can we be sure unless we see them in person and make them come in and do the literacy test? Every single restriction has used voter fraud as an excuse. And so it should not be a surprise that it is still the excuse today. And I think we have to look at that excuse in the context of all that's come before. If the person keeps on saying the same thing over and over again, then maybe the intent remains the same too. And I will tell you, that is what the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights' Kansas Advisory Council concluded. They did a report just a few weeks ago on the voting restrictions in Kansas. It's called the SAFE Act. They did a report where they examined it, and their conclusion was that the restrictions in Kansas are racist in their implementation and impact, but were also racist in their intent. That they were specifically passed for racially discriminatory reasons. That's something that we all ought to be concerned about. We ought to be concerned about that sort of behavior in Kansas, and we ought to be concerned about it in the other 22 states around the country that have done similar things. That's why we at the ACLU are fighting very hard against these restrictions in Kansas and around the country. We have 4 separate lawsuits in Kansas challenging these restrictions. We're winning all 4 of them at this point. But in the meantime, there's more that we have to do as a community in order to make sure that everyone has the right to vote and that everyone counts. We have to, for example, get rid of these restrictions everywhere they are on the books. It's not enough just for courts to strike them down. That's great. I'll take it. It's impactful. It makes a difference. But I would much rather that legislatures and communities all over this country be on record as saying this is not who we are. This is not what we stand for. This is not what we want to be about. We don't want to be about excluding people and discriminating against them. Instead, we want to make a statement that everyone counts. And the only way to do that is to repeal the restrictions legislatively, not just have courts strike them down. The second thing that we can do at the federal level is restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So there was a bill in Congress last year that would restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965, would restore the provisions that the Supreme Court struck down, but would do it in a new way that John Roberts and others had already said was acceptable. In their opinion, when they struck down a key part of the act, they also gave a roadmap for what you could do in the future to make it acceptable to them. And so there was a bill in Congress that would have done that. It had the support of every Democrat in Congress and about half of the Republicans in Congress. And yet it was never even scheduled for a vote because none of the people who supported it happened to be in the leadership of Congress. And so it never even got a vote. That bill has been introduced again. If it were heard, it would probably pass if the leadership would get on board with it. But they don't. They won't. And the only way that it will ever pass is if there is a widespread outcry all around the country to encourage legislators in Congress, your member of Congress, to support restoring the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If you do that, the federal government will be able to intervene in ways to protect the right to vote. There will be standards, there will be things to make sure that discriminatory practices are not implemented. And then the third thing that we can do to end the racially discriminatory impacts of voting rights restrictions is to pass something called Election Day registration. Election Day registration means that you go to one table to register to vote, and you go to the next table and can vote. Right up until until Election Day itself. During the advanced voting period up until Election Day itself, you can go the same day and register and actually vote. They've shown that everywhere this happens, it results in an immediate 11% increase in voter turnout. Among every demographic, everyone is more likely to participate when you get rid of the barriers, when you get rid of the burdens. People want to participate, you make it easy for them, they actually will participate. And so we need to pass Election Day registrations all over this country. When you do that, people feel more engaged in their communities, and best of all, politicians can't take anyone for granted. Right now, when a politician is running for office, they have a list of everyone who is registered to vote. They focus all of their efforts just on the folks who are on that list. Why? Because they have limited resources. They're making the smart call to only focus on the people who are on the list. If, however, everyone can vote right up until the day, you don't know who the universe of voters is other than everyone until the day of the election, politicians have to do a much better job of communicating to everyone, meeting the interests and needs of all parts of the community, and saying that everyone matters. If you get rid of that artificial red tape that says you only matter if you manage to register 2 or 3 weeks ahead of the election, you make sure that everyone is a much closer part of the community and that the community is tighter knit. So those are the 3 things that we can do that will make an impact, reduce some of the racial disparities that we see in voting rates. Regardless, I think that we have to do something. We have to do something in Kansas and across America because there is too much at stake. And anytime I think about this, anytime I think about what is at stake, I think back to Barbara Jordan, Congresswoman from Texas, the first African-American woman elected from the South. And she became famous especially during the Watergate hearings when she was on the committee and made this amazing speech that still goes down in sort of all the textbooks as exactly what a political speech should be. And there's one particular part of it that resonates with me and that I think is particularly relevant when I think about this topic. And here is what she said at that time, at the Watergate hearings. She said, "We heard the beginning of the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. We, the people. It's a very eloquent beginning. But when that document was completed on the 17th of September in 1787, I was not included in that we, the people. I felt somehow for many years that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton just left me out by mistake. But through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, I have finally been included in we, the people." That's what all of this is really about. That's what all of the struggles about voting rights are really about. Are we a country that really believes in we, the people? Or are we a country that believes in them, some of the people? Or they, some of the white people? Are we a country that believes in we, the people, or not? The battle over voting rights is really about whether we are going to make a liar out of Barbara Jordan or not. It's about whether everyone really counts. It's about whether everyone is really included. And I think it would be a shame if we made a liar out of Barbara Jordan. I think it would be a shame if we did not do everything we could after 2.5 centuries of making progress towards saying that everyone counts, everyone is part of we the people. I think it would be a shame if we allowed that progress to be undone. Thank you very much.